We've already finished talking about the function of many of the cell organelles that make up plant and animal cells. In this video, though, we're going to take a closer look at the cell membrane. We're going to look at its structure and function and how those are really important to the cell. Make sure that while you're watching this video, you're taking notes and that you go back and re-watch any part that you're confused on.
Before we can talk about the structure and function of the cell membrane, it's important to understand what structure and function mean. We're going to use the Zakim Bridge in Boston as an example to understand structure and function. If we're looking at the structure of the Zakim Bridge, we're going to be talking about what the bridge is made of. We might say something like, the bridge is made of metal support rods. We might say something like, the bridge is made of cement beams. You might even say they're in the shape of a triangle. The important thing is, we're talking about the structure, so we are only talking about the components of the bridge that make it up. So whenever you're talking about structure of anything, you want to just think, what is it made of? When we're talking about the function of the Zakim Bridge, we would say something like, it's what it's used for. So in the case of the Zakim Bridge, it's used for cars to get from one location in Boston to another, or cars to drive over. It's important to understand the difference between structure and function, structure being what something's made of, and function just being how it's used.
First thing we're going to talk about is what is the structure of the cell membrane.
The structure of the cell membrane is called a lipid bilayer. It's called a bilayer because it has two layers. The top one being 1, bottom being 2, and it's called a lipid bilayer because each one of these little balloon-looking things is actually something called a phospholipid, which means it's made up of lipids in a phosphate group. But in order to understand why this lipid bilayer forms, it's actually important to understand a little bit about phospholipids. Phospholipids have two parts. They have something called a head and a tail. The head is hydrophilic. This means that it loves water. So hydrophilic means it loves water. And the tail is hydrophobic. Hydrophobic means it hates water. And you might have heard of things like claustrophobia, people who hate tight spaces, arachnophobia, people who hate spiders. Phobia just means fear of.
So how does this relate back to our cell membrane? Well, if the heads love water and the tails hate water, then the heads are going to go towards water and the tails are going to try to hide from it. In the case of a cell, you know that the cytoplasm is full of water. It's a jelly-like liquid substance. And you may not know, but the solution that cells are sitting in is also water. So if you have a typical cell that maybe looks like this, you have water inside the cell, but you also have water outside the cell. So if you zoom in to a small portion of the cell membrane, what you have is you have the heads of the phospholipid facing out where there's water. You have the tails protected because water can't get in this region. And then you have the other heads facing towards the water on the bottom or inside the cell. In addition to lipids, your cell membrane is also made up of proteins. So in this picture of the cell membrane, you can find the lipids are just the small little molecules right here. But these big molecules floating inside this lipid bilayer are the proteins. So the structure of the cell membrane is that it's made up of tons of little lipids, and inside those lipids are floating these proteins. All these purple molecules represent proteins. And there are a lot of proteins, but there are definitely more lipids. Alright, now it's time to check yourself. For the following questions, do these in your notes somewhere so that you can show them to me in class. You need to describe the structure of a table, describe the function of a table, what two macromolecules make up the cell membrane, and describe the structure of the cell membrane. Make sure you write the answer to these somewhere in your notes and pause the video until you finish. The next thing we're going to talk about is the function of the cell membrane. So the cell membrane has three major functions. The first one is it protects the cell. So it's the bodyguard, it keeps things from coming in that maybe would harm the cell. It also helps move substances and messages in and out. So it regulates what can come into the cell, what can go out. And lastly, it maintains homeostasis. Homeostasis is something we're going to talk about throughout the year, but it just regulates the cell. We've talked about the structure of the cell membrane, that it's made up of lipids, called the phospholipid bilayer, and it's made up of proteins. But what do the proteins in the cell membrane do, or what is the function of the proteins? The proteins help molecules pass through the membrane. The lipids, or the phospholipid bilayer, act as a sort of wall. Not many things are getting through these lipids. Most things are hitting them and then bouncing in the opposite direction. Because this is a wall, all these lipids are really close together, nothing's getting through. But you'll notice in these proteins, there's something that kind of looks like a tunnel or a channel. And if you're the right size, and you try to fit through here, you just float right on through this channel, and you can get into the cell. Or if the opposite were true, you were trying to get out, maybe you would float right out through this channel, and then you can get out of the cell. However, not everything can get in and out of a cell, even through the proteins. The cell membrane is something called semi-permeable, or selectively permeable. They kind of mean the same thing. So semi-permeable and selectively permeable just means that not everything can get in. The membrane allows some molecules to get in, but it also keeps others out. If you're a small molecule, like this red one right here, you can easily fit through this protein channel. But let's say you're not a small molecule. Let's pretend you're this big blue molecule. When you try to pass through this channel, you're too big, and you end up just bouncing off this protein, this wall, and staying outside the cell. Other things that can't quite make it through the cell membrane are ions, or other molecules that have a charge. Right? Sometimes people compare the cell membrane to a bouncer in a club, right? So the bouncer is only going to let certain people in, certain people out. If you're underage, you're going to get bounced, just like if you're an ion or you're too big, you're going to get bounced. If you have an ID and you're the right age, you're going to be let in. So selectively permeable is how you would describe the cell membrane. And you would just say it functions to let small, nonpolar molecules pass through, but keep other molecules out. Lastly, try to answer the following 4 questions. Write the answer to these questions in your notes as well, so that you know you understood everything from the previous video. If you have any questions on this video, go back and re-watch parts. Make sure you can answer all the check for yourself questions, and also make sure you've completed notes on this video.